The HOA sent out their so-called enforcers with spike strips, but they didn't know they were messing with the county sheriff himself. I wasn't wearing the uniform that night. No badge on my chest, no cruiser parked by the curb. Just me, a man heading home after another long day, hoping for quiet. I thought I'd left the battles at the office. But sometimes the ugliest wars aren't fought in the streets, they're fought right. Outside your front door, the neighborhood was supposed to be peaceful. That's why I bought here. Tree-lined roads, a small lake at the edge, kids riding bikes without fear, neighbors waving from their porches. But in the past few months, peace had been replaced with paranoia. Letters stuffed into mailboxes, fines piling up, and menacing knocks on doors at all hours. The HOA called it upholding standards. I called it harassment. And I wasn't the only one. Mrs. Jameson, who'd lived here 30 years, broke down crying on my porch because her wildflowers didn't meet regulations. The Thompsons got fined for letting their daughter chalk up the driveway with drawings of butterflies. One veteran down the block was threatened with eviction because his flagpole was too tall. People were scared. Scared of their own neighbors. Scared of the board? And then came the so-called enforcers. Men with clipboards at first. Reflective vests. Then it escalated. Confrontations in the street. Photos taken through windows. Rumors of late-night patrols. You could feel the fear every time you stepped outside. And that night, I found out just how far they'd gone. The road narrowed under a canopy of trees as I turned into the subdivision. My headlights picked up a glimmer across the asphalt, a shimmer that didn't belong. My gut clenched. Years in law enforcement teach you to recognize danger before your brain fully processes it. Spike strips. At first, I didn't want to believe it. Who in their right mind would lay down spike strips in a family neighborhood? I slowed, squinting, and then I saw them two men crouched low in the shadows, watching. Waiting predators, they thought I was prey. I eased my truck to a stop a few yards away, killed the engine, and sat there in the silence. My window was down. The night air was heavy, carrying the sound of my own heartbeat. One of them muttered something to the other, then laughed. This was entertainment for them. I opened my door and stepped out slowly, boots crunching against gravel. That single sound carried farther than I expected. They stiffened. One stepped forward, chest puffed like he owned the road. Streets closed. Turn it around. I didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just stared. HOA rules, he barked louder. No through traffic after hours. I let the corner of my mouth twitch into something between a smile and a snarl. Funny thing, I said calmly, last I checked. Spike strips aren't exactly part of HOA guidelines. The second man shifted, flashlight trembling in his grip. Recognition was starting to flicker, but not fully. Not yet. I took another step forward, slow, deliberate. The first one bristled. Look, I don't care who you are. Turn the truck around now, or we'll... That's when I pulled out my badge. Not waving it. Not shoving it in their faces. Just letting it catch the beam of their own flashlight. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The color drained from their faces. One stammered. The other muttered a curse. And in that instant, I could see the realization dawn on them. The man they'd tried to intimidate wasn't just another tired homeowner. He was the sheriff of the entire county. Now, you'd think that would be enough to make them back off. But bullies, when cornered, are dangerous. They don't fold easy. The first one straightened his shoulders, defiance lacing his voice. Sheriff or not, he said, we've got authority here. The HOA gave us orders. That right there, that was the moment my anger boiled over. They actually believed it. Believed a neighborhood board gave them the right to lay spike strips. Believed they could intimidate families, veterans, children. Believed they were above the law. I stepped closer until there were barely 2 feet between us. My voice dropped, steady as steel. You lay down a weapon on a public road. You endanger every man, woman, and child who drives through here. That's not enforcement. That's a crime. The second man faltered, lowering his flashlight. The first one hesitated, jaw clenched, but his bravado was cracking. He looked like a wolf suddenly realizing the prey had teeth. "Pick it up," I ordered. He didn't move. I said, "Pick it up now." This time the authority in my voice left no room for negotiation. He bent down, hands shaking, and dragged the spike strip to the side of the road. His partner avoided my eyes completely. "You think this is over?" I asked, voice low, almost a whisper. "You think you get to terrorize your neighbors and walk away clean?" "No, this doesn't end tonight. This is just where it starts." And then I turned my back on them because sometimes that's more powerful than any threat. Walking away told them I wasn't scared, that they no longer had control of this moment. But as I slid back into my truck, I caught sight of movement in my rearview mirror. A curtain in a nearby window, a face peeking out wide-eyed. They'd been watching. My neighbors had seen everything. And in that moment, I realized something else. This wasn't just about me. This was bigger. Every family in this neighborhood was living under fear. Every resident had been bullied into silence. And if I didn't act not as a sheriff, not as a neighbor, but as a man, this HOA would only get worse. I started my truck, the rumble breaking the night's tension, and drove slowly forward, leaving the two enforcers standing in the dark. But in my chest, something heavier had settled. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because sometimes, when people abuse power, you have to remind them what real authority looks like, and trust me are going to want to hear how this plays out. Because what happened next turned the entire neighborhood upside down. But before I tell you that, let me ask you, what would you do if you came home to find spike strips laid out in front of your truck by your own HOA? Would you back down? Or would you stand your ground knowing everyone else on your street was depending on you too? Stay with me. Because if you think this night was bad, you haven't seen anything yet. The spike strips were gone, but the weight of that night clung to me like smoke. Driving away, I thought the danger had ended, but in truth, it had only just begun. The next morning, word had already spread. That's how it is in small neighborhoods, nothing stays secret for long. By the time I walked out to grab my paper, 3 different neighbors had stopped me, each whispering the same thing. "We saw." Their voices trembled with a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that someone had finally stood up to the so-called enforcers. Fear of what the retaliation might be. Because bullies don't just quit, they double down. And sure enough, before noon, the letters came. Thick white envelopes stamped with the HOA seal, shoved into every mailbox like warnings. My own letter read, "Violation. Unauthorized vehicle use of restricted road. Fine. $750. Repeat offenses may result in legal action, including foreclosure." I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because the arrogance of it was staggering. Spike strips on a public road, and I'm the one being fined. I had no clue who they were dealing with. But the laughter didn't last. It's because when I walked over to Mrs. Jameson's house to check in on her, I found her clutching the exact same letter her fine was for unauthorized planting. $500 for the roses she'd tended for years. Tears streaked her cheeks as she whispered, "I can't pay this, Sheriff. They'll take my home. The Thompsons got one too. $1,200 for yard clutter. The yard looked fine to me, just a couple toys by the porch and the veteran, Hughes, threatened with forced compliance if he didn't take down his flag. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was a shakedown. A system built on fear and money. And now that I'd stood up to them, the HOA was escalating their war. That evening, I walked the block. No uniform, no badge visible. Just a neighbor listening. And what I heard broke me more than any crime scene ever had. Parents afraid their kids couldn't play outside. Families hiding bills under kitchen counters because they couldn't keep up with fines. Elderly neighbors too scared to answer their doors at night when the enforcers came knocking. I'd seen gangs do this. I'd seen cartels do this. But a neighborhood association? This was worse because it wore the mask of legitimacy. So I made a choice. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, inside the community center. They never expected me to show up. They never expected anyone to. That's how they thrived through silence. But Thursday came, and I walked through those double doors, not as sheriff, Not even as a lawman, but as a neighbor. I kept my uniform off. But in my pocket, my badge was burning like fire. The room was already packed. Board members sat smug at the front table, papers stacked like weapons. The enforcers leaned in the back, arms crossed, eyes darting around like wolves guarding their territory. The HOA president, a tall man with a silver tie and a voice sharp as a blade, called the meeting to order. First item on the agenda, non-compliance reports. That's when I stood. A chair scraped the floor loud enough to draw every eye. Silence fell. You could feel the tension crawl across the room. Before you go through your reports, I said, voice steady, we need to talk about last night. A ripple of murmurs spread. The president stiffened. This is not the time for personal grievances. You may submit a written. I cut him off. Spike strips, gasps, whispers, faces turning pale. The enforcers shifted uncomfortably at the back. The president's jaw tightened. That matter has already been addressed, letting the word hang heavy. You call laying down weapons on a public road addressed? You endangered children, families, everyone in this room. His face reddened. You have no authority here? The HOA sets the rules. That's when I pulled the badge from my pocket. Didn't wave it, didn't shout, just set it on the table where the overhead light gleamed against the gold. The room fell dead silent. I am the sheriff of this county, I said, voice low but carrying. And let me make this clear. HOA or not, you don't stand above the law. Spike strips are a felony. Harassment is a crime. Extortion is a crime. And if this doesn't stop, I will bring charges. The president sputtered, but his words tangled in his throat. The neighbors God, I'll never forget their faces. Hope, shock, fear melting into courage. Because for the first time, someone had said it out loud. They weren't powerless. Then a voice rose from the crowd. Mrs. Jameson, trembling, stood to her feet. They fined me for my roses, another voice followed. The Thompsons. They said we'd lose our house over toys in the yard. The veteran slammed his palm against his cane. They told me to take down my flag. It's not in my lifetime. Voices built, one after another, like sparks catching fire. The HOA board tried to gavel it down, tried to silence them, but it was too late. The silence had been broken, and once people taste courage, they don't give it back. That night didn't end peacefully. The president stormed out. Enforcers threatened lawsuits. But when I walked home, the air felt lighter. For the first time in months, neighbors weren't looking over their shoulders. They were looking forward. But I knew better than to think it was over. Bullies don't just fade into the night. They regroup. They scheme. And sure enough, the retaliation came fast. 2 nights later, my truck tires were slashed. A note left under the windshield. Sheriff or not, you don't run this place. We do. And the next morning, a notice taped to my door. Violation. Harassment of HOA board. Fine. $5,000. Repeat offenses may result in foreclosure. It would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. They were trying to bankrupt me, intimidate me, force me out. And if they were willing to do this to me, imagine what they'd do to the neighbors who didn't have a badge in their pocket. I stood on my porch, the note crumpled in my fist, and made a vow. Enough. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every neighbor too afraid to speak, every family threatened into silence. If the HOA wanted a war, they had one. This time the whole county would hear about it. So I picked up my phone, dialed a number I hadn't called in years, and said the words I knew would change everything. It's time to open an investigation. Because sometimes, when power gets corrupted, you don't just fight it with courage, you fight it with the truth. And trust me, the truth was about to tear this HOA apart from the inside, but that's not the end of the story, not by a long shot. Because what I uncovered next, it didn't just shake my neighborhood, it shook the entire town. Stay with me. You'll want to see how far this rabbit hole went. When I called for an investigation, I expected pushback. What I didn't expect was how deep the rot ran. Within days, my deputies began pulling records. Fines collected by the HOA weren't going toward community improvements. No new playgrounds, no repaired fences, no road maintenance. Instead, Thousands of dollars were funneling into consulting fees and security contracts and those so-called enforcers. They weren't volunteers. They were being paid with the money squeezed out of terrified families. The paper trail was sloppy. That's the thing about arrogance. It makes people careless. But as we dug deeper, we uncovered something uglier. Bank accounts in other states, shell companies. Even threats against homeowners, documented in emails. The HOA president, a silver-tie tyrant, wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor. He was running the board like a business profiting off fear. And the enforcers? They weren't even residents. Outsiders brought in to intimidate, scare, and silence. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. Not as a sheriff, as a man. Because this wasn't just corruption, it was betrayal. Betrayal of trust. Betrayal of community. But exposing the truth on paper wasn't enough. People needed to see it, to believe it, so we organized another meeting. This time I didn't walk in alone. Deputies flanked me, not in full tactical gear, but in uniform. Enough to send a message. The law was present. The neighbors filled the room, shoulder to shoulder. Some clutching their letters of fines, others holding photos of damage done by the enforcers. Fear still lingered in their eyes, but it was mixed with something new, determination. The board sat at the front again, smug but twitching with unease. They didn't know what I had in my hand. I placed a stack of documents on the table. Bank statements, contracts, proof, neighbors, I began. Voice carrying across the room. For months, you've been told these fines were for your good. For the community? For order. But the truth is your money was stolen. Funneled into private pockets. Used to pay men to terrorize your streets. Gasps rippled through the room. The president tried to stand, tried to silence me with the gavel. I slammed my hand on the table, louder than any wooden mallet. You don't get to hide anymore, and then I laid it all bare. Every dollar stolen. Every shell company exposed. Every shady contract signed. Piece by piece, I ripped away the mask they'd worn for too long. The neighbors erupted. Shouts of anger. Cries of betrayal. The enforcers at the back shifted nervously, realizing the tide had turned. The president's face twisted, red with fury. This is slander, he bellowed. The HOA is untouchable. You think you can just waltz in here? That's when I cut him off. No, I don't think. I know. I motioned, and two deputies stepped forward. Handcuffs gleamed under the lights. The room went silent, every breath held. By order of the county, I said. You're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The crack of metal closing around his wrists was the sound of chains breaking. Not just his, but the chains that had held every neighbor in fear. The enforcers tried to slip out, but deputies blocked the doors. One by one, they were escorted out. No more shadows. No more intimidation. And then something happened I'll never forget, Mrs. Jameson. The woman whose roses had been threatened stepped forward with tears in her eyes. She wasn't trembling this time. Her voice was steady. Does this mean we re-free? I looked around that room at faces weathered by months of fear, but glowing now with hope, and I nodded. Yes, you re-free. But more than that. You're stronger, because you stood together. You spoke out. And no HOA, no bully, no thief can ever take that away again. The applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Neighbors hugging each other, tears streaming, voices raised. For the first time in too long, its community felt alive. But even as the celebration swelled, I knew the scars would remain. Trust takes time to rebuild. Fear doesn't vanish overnight. Yet maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better. That night, walking home under the same tree-lined streets that had once felt like a prison, I felt the weight lift from my chest. The spike strips were gone, the threats silenced, and for the first time, the neighborhood was truly safe. Not because of me, but because people realized the truth. Bullies only win when we stay silent. And maybe that's the lesson here. It doesn't matter if it's an HOA, a boss, a bully at school, or even your own fears. When someone tries to strip away your peace, you have two choices: bow down or stand up. I know which one I'll always choose. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever felt powerless in your own life, hear me now. You're stronger than you think. You're braver than you believe. And sometimes, the moment you decide to rise up is the very moment everything changes. Because the HOA sent out their so-called enforcers with spike strips. They thought they were in control. But what they didn't know was that they'd picked the wrong man, the wrong neighborhood, and the wrong fight. And I promise you, this justice always finds a way. So don't back down. Don't stay silent. And never forget, you have the power to take your peace back. Stay until the end. Because the best part isn't what I did, it's what we did together. And that's a story worth remembering.